So this is the fourth and final module, identifying California bumblebees. It's meant to be 90 minutes in length. I'm going to try to bring it in under maybe 70 so that we don't keep you longer than we said we would. And that means I'm going to skip a little bit of the detail at the end where I was going to show you in-depth identification information about each of our 25 species, but I'll probably gloss over some of them in the interest of time. I'll say at the outset again that your highest priority as a volunteer here is not to become an expert at identifying the bees themselves. We want you to enjoy yourself, and we want you to contribute to this important conservation initiative. But again, you do not have to be an expert at identification. We provide this information because we know many people are interested in it, and it does help you become better at the project. But again, please don't be turned off by the technical nature of some of this information. It is admittedly difficult to identify some of these animals. So again, I just wanted to note that we are not the first people to go down this road. We stand on the shoulders of a number of folks who have collected information about bumblebees in California. And lots of what I'll tell you in this module comes from the work of those folks. And I'm again going to recognize Dr. Robin Thorpe, who taught at UC Davis and passed away in 2019. He was a mentor to Rich and myself and many others in our community. He's also a peerless bumblebee taxonomist who had a penchant and interest in describing the natural history and ranges of bumblebees, and made just great contributions to our understanding of the bees here in California. So just keep that in mind as we present this information. I'm going to give you the basics of how to distinguish bumblebee from other insects, bumblebees from other bees, male from female bumblebees, and so on. And we'll use this flow chart, which looks like this. And I'll take each of these bifurcating pieces one at a time in the slides that follow. So first we'll talk about ways to distinguish bees, all bees, from other insects. So here are 5 images of insects. One, the cover of a book, and 4 others are photos by me and other people. And the question is, how many of these are bees? This is not a poll question, so I'll give you the answer now. The answer is just one of them. So all of these things look to me like bees, in at least in superficial ways. They're large, roundish-bodied animals that are furry and are associated with flowers. However, 4 of them are flies, and only one of them is the bee in the upper left-hand corner. Humorously to me, even the publishers of this important reference on bees called Bees of the World got it wrong on the cover of the first edition, although not the second edition, on which they replaced the fly photo with a bumblebee photo. So just to make the point that even those who work in this area sometimes mistake a fly for a bee, and it can be tricky. And I'll give you some ideas of how to avoid that yourself. So here are some key characteristics of bees. Bees are interesting in many ways. One of them is that they evolved from a wasp-like ancestor. So with wasps, they share a common ancestor. The key adaptation that makes bees different from almost all of the wasps is that instead of feeding animal protein to their offspring as the source of protein, animal tissues, they feed pollen. So bees are vegetarians, we could say, in almost all cases. They need pollen. And so bees have all of these adaptations for harvesting and carrying pollen. And I've talked about some of that. Here you can see on the right, a bumblebee who has packed pollen moistened with nectar into that scopa or corbicula or pollen basket on her hind leg. On the left, you see a megachilid bee, and this one has packed the pollen into a different place, a different scopa. It's on the underside of her abdomen, that yellow hairy area. That's all pollen. That is how that bee carries pollen home. So we look for these adaptations for pollen management. Bees tend to have long tongues as compared to some of their lookalikes. Their hairs are actually branched, at least some of their hairs are branched. Some bees have almost no visible hair, but all bees have branched hairs somewhere on their bodies. And it can take a microscope to find those branched hairs, but you can also see some of them on bumblebees quite readily with a hand lens or with a good eye. To go further, all bees have 2 sets of wings. They have 4 total wings. This is to distinguish them from flies, which have only 2 wings, 1 set of wings. Bees have somewhat rounded bodies, generally speaking. The females are often seen carrying pollen, as we've discussed. They are hairy, and those hairs can be branched. Their eyes are often at the sides of their head, as opposed to forward or in the front of the head and looking only forward. And then they have quite long antennae relative to some flies and other insects that look like them. So we'll contrast with flies here. So here are flies. Flies just have 2 wings. They actually have the second pair, but they're reduced to these little clubby things that are called ailerons that are important functional organelles or organs of flies, but they are not wings. They don't generate lift the way wings do. And it's very easy, obviously, to count wings and know whether or not you have a fly. Most flies do not eat pollen, and you won't see them doing anything with pollen particularly, although they're commonly encountered on flowers drinking nectar and doing other things. They can be hairy, they can be hairless, but they're usually not as hairy as bumblebees. Their eyes are often bulging, often front-facing, and their antennae are often thick or short and club-shaped, or a number of different shapes, but they're not these graceful, long, arching antennae that you'd get with a wasp or a bee. So here's a little comparison of wasps and bees. So wasps, like bees, have 4 wings, 2 pairs of wings. Their bodies tend to look narrower, and they often have a thread waist, a highly contracted area between the thorax and the abdomen, as you can see in the bottom left photo. Bees have a constriction there, but it's not quite as extreme. Most wasps do not eat or carry pollen. They may have pollen on their bodies, but you will not see them in most cases packing it into a carrying part of the body. Wasps are generally not so hairy. That hair won't be branched in almost all cases. And when you see brightly colored patterns on wasps, they usually are colors on the integument or the exoskeleton of the animal, not on the hair. And in the bees, it's usually, in the bumblebees, it's usually the hair. Although with bumblebees and other bees, it can be the color on the integument. So that's a quick and dirty distinction for bees versus other insects. Now let's distinguish bumblebees from other bees. And for other bees, after you figure out that you're not looking at a bumblebee, if you're interested, you can go further outside of the Xerces and Bumblebee Watch universe. You could go to Bug Guide, Discover Life, or iNaturalist. These are all wonderful online portals that can give you photos and range maps and observation data for all these other types of bees. And I'd encourage you to investigate those things if you're interested. So here are some bees that occur in California and look superficially anyway like bumblebees, and I'll try to use these as examples to show you how they're not. So on the left we have a centris, an oil bee. These are usually large-bodied, hairy bees. They're not social like bumblebees, although they may nest in aggregations where multiple females live next door to each other, but they don't have, they're not sharing labor to rear their offspring. They carry pollen on their hind legs like a bumblebee, but they have a hairy brush, as opposed to a shiny, hairless area with bristles around it. That's one way to distinguish this type of bee that is related to bumblebees. Next here we have carpenter bees. I think everybody's probably familiar with carpenter bees. They're large, often larger than a bumblebee, less hairy. Often you can see the integument or the exoskeleton shining in the sunlight below the hair. They're black. They're sometimes bright orange in color with one particular species in California. They can be 2 different colors of gray or yellow and black. Next we have honeybees. We've talked a little bit about honeybees today. Generally less hair. You see markings on the integument. You see dark and honey colored bands on the abdomen as opposed to yellow and black hair. And finally, I have this this example of Anthophora, this group of digger bees. They're similar to centris, the first one I spoke of. They're large, hairy. They have a brush of hairs for carrying pollen rather than a pollen basket as in the bumblebees. And they're solitary for them, I think entirely. So they don't have the social structure that we see with bumblebees living in a family unit as they do. Here are some more things about honeybees so that you can distinguish honeybees from bumblebees. So honeybees will often be a little smaller than a bumblebee. However, depending on the bumblebee, there are some workers that are smaller than a worker honeybee. So it's sort of medium size, I guess you could say. They have a distinctive shape that you can become familiar with. We've called it torpedo shaped here, a sort of oblong abdomen, whereas the bumblebee might have a sort of wider abdomen, thicker abdomen. That orange and black, orange, brown, and black coloration that we've described. Honeybees do have the pollen basket, just like bumblebees. So that is a similarity you'll have to work out. And then if you get a close enough look at a honeybee, you'll see that they have hairy eyeballs. Their compound eyes actually have hair all over them. And in this photo, you can, on the bottom right, you can hopefully see some hair on the margins of that right eye. This is just a distinctive thing you'll see up close with honeybees, and you do not see that on bumblebees because they do not have that hair. A little more detail about those carpenter bees. So they have the hairy scopa, the brush of hairs, as opposed to the pollen basket. As I said, you can see the shiny integument or exoskeleton under the hair, at least on the abdomen. The males will often have markings on that exoskeleton. So for example, bright yellow color on the face that is not hair, it's on the exoskeleton. You won't see that in bumblebees. Carpenter bees have a semi or subsocial life history, lifestyle, but it's much less complicated. It's usually just fewer than 10 bees, a mother and daughters perhaps, and they excavate in solid wood, including things like agave stems, to make their nests. And so they're not living underground in most cases, and they're also not looking for pre-existing cavities. You can see them chewing through hard wood, including on your house if you're unlucky. So here are some more characteristics of bumblebees. That large, very hairy and robust look to them. Black and yellow hair is typical of many species in our area, but that can be joined with orange, brown, or red, or even white hair. The pollen basket that we've discussed. So let's assume that we are able to distinguish this as a bee rather than some other insect. Oh, and it's a bumblebee rather than another type of bee. Now we want to know, is our bumblebee a male or a female bee? And so now we need to understand a few more things about the anatomy of the animal. So here are some technical terms and some common terms for some of the structures on the bees. As we've described before, we have three main body segments in insects, including bumblebees. We have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen going from front to back. Each of these can have 2 or more segments. And the only place that matters for you as a volunteer on this project is the abdomen, which I've described as having 6 or 7 segments, 7 for males and 6 for females. But you see the antenna, we'll talk more about that in a second. And then the presence or absence of the pollen basket on the hind leg. So here's a little comparison of a male and a female bumblebee of the same species. This is Bombus griseocollis, the brown-belted bumblebee. This one is primarily eastern in distribution, but we do have populations in Northern California starting around Arcata and going north. And I just want you to notice some of the defining characteristics that distinguish male from female bumblebees. So the one on the left is male, the one on the right is a female, a queen cast female. So in the red circle, you see on the right, you see the female has a pollen basket, a shiny, clear area with these bristles of hairs that arc over it. The male has some area that's shiny, but not as much, and he does not have so much of a bristle, set of bristles that covers that up. You will not see the males harvesting or transporting pollen whatsoever. Males have 1 extra segment in their antenna relative to females, so it's 13 versus 12. That is not an easy thing to count when they're alive and flying, but when they're anesthetized, you can actually make this count before they wake up. Also, males, as I said, have 7 rather than 6 abdominal segments. And so that amounts to a longer looking abdomen in many cases. Also, the tip of the abdomen does not have a sting in the male. Males cannot sting you. They have no sting. The reason for this is that the stinger is actually it's the ovipositor, the egg-laying part of the female, and it's repurposed through evolutionary adaptation to also deliver venom. So it is the female bees, the workers and the queen who can sting. The males cannot sting. And so that is reflected in the males having sort of a wedge-shaped hind end, whereas the females will have a more pointy 6th abdominal segment. And sometimes you'll be able to see that stinger sticking out of that pointy end. They may have just starkly different color patterns in the same species, or they may look very, very similar in color. And then size-wise, queens are going to be the largest bees in many cases. Males can be either larger or smaller than workers. It depends a great deal on which species we're talking about. So we have now worked through distinguishing bees from other insects, bumblebees from other bees, and male and female bumblebees. Now we need to distinguish the cuckoo bumblebees from the non-cuckoo bumblebees. And so we'll do this separately for male bees, bumblebees, and female bumblebees. And I'll do that here in this slide. So starting with males, we have a picture of the hind leg of a Cytherus or cuckoo bumblebee and a non-cuckoo bumblebee, and same for the females. So here's up close what a cuckoo bumblebee male hind leg looks like. So if you see that segment where we would expect a pollen carrying apparatus, there are 2 reasons this bee does not have one. First, it's a boy and they don't harvest pollen, they don't carry pollen. And second, it's a cuckoo bumblebee, and those species, as I've told you, they attack a host colony and they do not have to collect their own pollen. So in this case, the males, if it's a male Cytherus or cuckoo bumblebee, it's not going to have a concavity. It's not going to have a shiny hairless area. You can see it's a little shiny, but it is bristly and bumpy. And then there are some hairs on the side, but they're not this big collection of arching bristles as we'd see in a female bee. Here's a non-Cytherus male. So this guy also does not have any business carrying pollen, and he does not have that adaptation that we've talked about numerous times. However, this is a non-cuckoo bumblebee species. The females of this species do carry pollen, and he does have a smaller area that is hairless and somewhat shiny, and it is somewhat concave. And we'll just have to contrast that with the females of the non-cuckoos in just a second. So here's the female cuckoo bumblebee, and that's her hind leg. And here you can see that segment again, this tarsal segment on the hind leg. Again, it's a little shiny, but it is bumpy. It is not clear of hair. It is also not particularly concave. It's just not designed for carrying pollen. By contrast, here is the 4th category here, the non-cuckoo bumblebee females. These are the bees that harvest the pollen and carry it home. And now you can see a much more real estate here for actually packing moistened pollen into that hind leg tarsal segment. And you can see these really long hairs on the sides. And so the bee will stick the pollen in there and the hairs get incorporated, and it's just a big sticky mess. And that is how they move that pollen home. So in the field, if you're interested to distinguish the cuckoo bumblebees from the others and the males from the females, you'll need to look at this hind leg character. And of course, you'll need to take good photos of it also. So getting farther into bumblebee morphology, again, here are those 3 body segments. And we divide the abdomen, as I've said, into numerous segments, 6 for females and 7 for males. Again, those are called terga, and the singular is tergum. And we abbreviate that as a T. So you'll see in identification materials, and you'll hear me say, T1 in this case is yellow, T2 is black, T3 is black, like that. For the underside of the abdomen, that's the sternal segments. And just like your chest is called your sternum, right? And those are also numbers. So we have S1 through S6 for females, S1 through S7 for males, and you will see that in identification materials also. And again, I've mentioned this, but the head comes with two different hair areas that you need to pay attention to. The face, which is in between and around the antennae. And then on the top of the head, that's the vertex. And then there are two types of eyes. We have compound eyes and we have simple eyes or ocelli. And the ocelli are those three bumps that are central between the vertex and the face hair. And the reason you need to think about those morphological structures, the eyes of two sorts, is that depending on the species and the sex, we can get really bulgy eyes, or we can get ocelli are moved forward or backward relative to the compound eyes a little bit in some species. So photos that show the eyes in some respect can be very important. And I'll zip through this photo. This is just another look at the head now from the front, and you can see the same some of the structures identified here. And I guess to pay attention to where those ocelli are now from, or simple eyes are relative to the compound eyes. And that dashed line is meant to show you that two of them are behind a line that connects the top of the compound eyes. This is getting down in the weeds, but this is the kind of thing we need to do to identify some of our bumblebees. Now, this is quite possibly the most important thing I'll say to you about bumblebee identification today. The shape and size of the cheek is critical for distinguishing many of these bees. And you'll learn why in just a minute. We can't always use the brightly colored hair patterns to identify the bees. We have to go further and actually look at morphology of the skeleton, of the exoskeleton. So here are three species that are all related to each other, and they have different sized cheeks. By cheek, I mean the area that is below the compound eye and above where the mouth part or mandible attaches. So in the central photo, you can see the mandible that's hanging down a little bit. That's the jaw, the chewing part. And just where it attaches is the base of the cheek. So the cheek is from the bottom of the compound eye to just where that mandible attaches. And in these three species, I hope you can see that I've bracketed a long, a medium, and a short cheek. And this is difficult until you become conversant and you have experience. So we're going to show you more photos, and I'm going to repeat myself as I go through the rest of the slides. As I transition to the next slide, it is not only the length of the cheek, it is the proportion of the length to the width that matters. So here we have a nice photo of the rusty patch bumblebee. This is a queen. Obviously this one doesn't occur in California, but this is a good example that shows you these two dimensions. You do not need to, and in fact you wouldn't be able to get out a ruler and measure these things on a live anesthetized bee. You're going to have to eyeball it. And this is a place where a hand lens can be particularly useful. The naked eye can do it just fine with the right light in a bee that is not moving too much. For me, a nearsighted person, I take off my glasses and I can see this thing pretty well as long as I have enough light. But again, look at those two arrows, the semi-vertical set. One is the length, right, from the bottom of the eye to the top of the mandible. The other one is showing you the width where the mandible attaches to the cheek. In this case, the length is just shorter than the width. So in identification materials, you'll see this species is distinguished from other lookalikes by its cheek, which has a ratio in this space of less than 1. And we're going to refer to this cheek, well, we can call it the cheek, but you'll see it commonly referred to as the malar space, M-A-L-A-R. The ratio of this length to width is what we'll be talking about. So I will refer to that commonly in just a second as we go through some looking at actual species, okay? So why is it so hard to identify these brightly colored, large, and approachable insects without referring to these very highly specific parts of the face morphology? Well, the hair color patterns are variable, but there's a lot of similarity among species, and we don't have that many morphological characters that we can use, such as that malar ratio that I just described. You'll see that there just aren't many other body parts that we can measure and say it's longer in this one and shorter in this one. So hair color patterns are absolutely where you should start as you learn to identify bumblebees. It's the easiest place to start, but you should just know that you will not be able to identify all of them to species based on hair color pattern alone. And here's why, in a nutshell. So within one species, we see a lot of variation. This is a plate from that Bumblebees in North America book. This is one species. There's more, bear with me for a minute. This used to be thought of as a single species. There are red colored abdomens in some places. There are black colored abdomens in some places. There's black and red mixing in. There's black, red, and yellow. It's very complicated. And this is just one taxon called Bombus bifarious. Now, there is an open question going on about this species as to whether it is 2 or even 3 species. I'm going to pretend for now it's just one, but I will mention this again in a second. But you can see that if you are a California bumblebee biologist, Bombus bifarious is going to be black and yellow in your area, and there's some other characters we'll get into. However, if you take a vacation to Colorado, you'll find the same bee and it will look quite different, very bright orange in place of those black bands. So that's one reason it's tricky. Here's another one. It turns out that many species living in the same general area will evolve rapidly to look highly similar to each other. So the genetics underlying color pattern determination in bumblebees are fairly simplistic and labile. So they, within a relatively short period of time, you can get a population of bees that expresses one color pattern versus another. And we think, and we don't know this for sure, but we think that the selection event that drives that kind of evolution is predation. And so the more bees that look the same in any given area, the stronger the signal to predators that if you eat this thing, that it has a bright orange stripe, for example, you will get stung. So what that means for us as human beings who are interested in bumblebees is we have these mimetic complexes, these mimicry complexes where the bumblebees tend to look very similar. So in California, we have at least 4 of these complexes where, so for example, on the bottom left, the top of the 2 purple rectangles there, the mostly black bees with yellow hair on the front of the thorax and a single or maybe 2 stripes on the abdomen in yellow. That's a very typical color pattern that we see extensively along the Pacific coast. We don't have any species that look like that in the Eastern US. And it's just to give you the example that they probably converged on this book. And it makes it difficult for you as the bumblebee identifier to figure out, is this one variable species, as we've said on the left hand, or is this 5 species, as he said on the right hand side of the slide. So we'll move forward and try to help you understand how to navigate this. So this image here is a simple graphic that shows you color patterns that are typical of female cast bumblebees in California. We have 25 species that are native here. And in this graphic, I've represented at most, I think, 2 versions of any given species. And I've lumped them in these gross, basic general color patterns. It's a good way to start your career as a bumblebee identifier. And so I'll go through them in more detail, but you can see I've got all the red ones lumped, and then I've got various degrees of striping and presence of white hair and such here. And so obviously what the goal is for you to take the bee in hand, let's say the photo you just took of this bee on the right, and then to take this graphic and try to figure out which color pattern matches the bee that I'm looking at. And in this case, this is Bombus huntii, a common California species. So I'll go through those groupings that are on that little graphic, and then I'm going to show you representatives of each of those groups. I do not have time to show you all bees, all species that occur here, as we've discussed, but I'll do my best. So the first group I'm going to give you is the cuckoo bumblebees. And instead of using the gross color patterns to put them into this group, I'm saying we're putting cuckoo bumblebees into this group, and we would rely on those characters that we've already studied to identify them, namely that none of them will have pollen harvesting and carrying apparatus, including the females. They will have hind legs that are not good for anything but walking, not good for pollen carrying anyway. There are a few other characteristics that we can get into as we go forward here. Next, a category where it's bees, bumblebees that have white hair present somewhere on the body. And in California, this is limited for the most part to just 3 species. And here we have 4 representatives because the Western bumblebee comes in basically 2 flavors that include white. Next, we'll get into bees that have various degrees of striping on the abdomen, but the T1, the first tergum, the first segment of the abdomen that's closest to the thorax is black as opposed to being yellow. So look, scan across these images. That's the key thing you see is variable color patterns on the abdomen, and the first segment is black. Now, there's a whole other set where I would say the same thing. They have variable abdomen color patterns, but the first segment is yellow, at least in part. And so this is a very coarse way to divide the majority of our species, but it is pretty useful in many cases. And so you'll see that in a second. And then finally, the category where there is orange or red hair somewhere on the body. And it's quite easy, obviously, to put them all in the same category because our eyes immediately pick up that color, that range of hues. But keep in mind, as I said already, that one species could belong to multiple groups, right? So bifarious was our example before. It's in the upper left-hand corner in this slide. And here I'm showing it with the orange belt. It also comes in a version in California without the orange color. Now taking it, starting with the orange colored ones, I'm going to show you some representatives in that group. Then we'll move into some of those other categories. Here is of a common species found in California, primarily east of the Sierra Nevadas and on the east slope of the mountains. They are found at upper elevations as well as down a bit lower. Also found in Northern California. This bee is common throughout the West, as you can see in that thumbnail map that I will include in each of these slides. I've included the little thumbnail graphics from the bumblebees of North America in this slide. And you can see that we show queens, workers, and males. And when I show more than one color pattern for a sex or caste, it's because they typically come in 2 flavors or 3. This is not an exhaustive treatment of all the possible color patterns, as you'll hear me say as I go through this. But I'll tell you that for hunty eye, for hunt bumblebee, this is a very constant species. You're not going to see very much variation in this species. It's going to have yellow on the first abdominal segment. It will always have red or orangish hair on the second 2, followed by yellow. It will have black hairs on the pollen basket, the bristles on the side of the basket, which are mostly covered up by pollen in this picture. They're black, not orange. And we'll talk in a minute about who has orange. If we looked closely at the face, we would see that the malar ratio, the ratio of cheek length to cheek width, is about equal. It's a square, more or less. And this yellow hair on the front of the thorax is pure. There's little or no black hair mixed in with it. As you'll see, that is a very common trait in other bees where we're mixing. So that's something we would look for. I won't explain every slide in this much detail, but I want you to see that this is like, in my construction here, this is like a bird field guide, perhaps a Peterson's field guide, where we have identification marks that are pointed out as the key characteristics you need to look for to distinguish this species from similar ones. And I've got some similar species listed up at the top there. Oh, one more thing. In each of the maps, I'm dividing the recent time period from the historic, and I have arbitrarily defined recent as the last 20 years, and historic as everything before 2001. So in this example, you can see that many of the historic localities have been vouchered in the modern period. So that's an index that this bee, hunt bumblebee, persists in those areas, like the East Slope around Bishop, California, for example. However, in Modoc County, up in the northeastern part of the state, we have some observations from the historical period that have not been repeated. It may be that the bee is gone from there. It may be that nobody has gone to look. So there are at least 2 ways for you to interpret that discordance between historic and recent observations. Moving on to another fairly common species, widely distributed in the West. This is a central bumblebee, Bombus centralis, quite similar in its first glimpse to hunt bumblebee, except you'll recall with hunt bumblebee, we had the first abdominal segment was yellow, the second and third were red, and the fourth was yellow. Well, here we have 2 yellows and 2 oranges or reds, and then we don't have any more yellow after that. So that's a very obvious field character. You can learn to distinguish these 2 bees. It's not the only thing you need to see, but it is, to the untrained eye, you might not notice this difference, but then once you start segmenting out the abdomen, you see immediately, oh, that's a completely different look. It's the difference between wing bars on one bird versus lack of wing bars on another bird, if you're from the bird world. So central bumblebee is mainly found east of the Sierra Nevada and in northeastern California. And I'm unclear, I think we're all unclear on the status of this bee in California. It is not rare, but this project will help us clarify what's going on with it. This is one where the malar ratio is about equal to a little bit longer than wide, so just greater than 1. And that would help you to distinguish it from hunt bumblebee if you are uncertain about those other characteristics. Here's another one that has red hair on the abdomen. This is Bombus mixtus, the fuzzy horned bumblebee. This is a beautiful animal that you can see throughout the Sierra Nevadas and the northern mountains. It's also found commonly, but sparingly in certain areas of the California coast. So pretty common around the San Francisco Bay Area at sea level, and also Northern California, Eureka, Arcata, and points north. It's got a red tail. It is not the only bumblebee species with a red tail, but that is a distinctive character that you can look for. It's also got a dirty sort of look to the hair at the front of the thorax, a mix of yellow and black hair that makes it sort of gray, not pitch black gray, not pitch black and not bright yellow. It's a mix of the two, and it looks a little dingy in bright sunlight. And that is a field character that will really help you to identify this bee. And you can see in these graphics that we use a sort of greenish gray color to indicate that mixture of black and yellow hairs, which is typical for this species. This species has a malar ratio that's about equal. So the cheek is square, more or less. Here's another one that has prominent orange hair on the abdomen. However, this one, it does not always have the orange or red hair on the abdomen. This is red-belted bumblebee. It is found broadly across the United States and adjacent Canada. As you can see on that thumbnail map in California, it is another one that's found mostly east of the Sierras and in Northern California, although there are populations in the San Francisco Bay Area that are distinctly different in coloration. This is probably the most variable of all the species of bumblebees in North America, hence my little jocular joke at the top there. Expect it to have orange or red hair on the abdomen in California, although not in the San Francisco Bay Area necessarily. It has quite short hair. It typically has a very distinctive oval black band between the bases of the wings on the thorax, where that purple arrow is pointing. It's a distinctive pattern, just this sort of oval that connects the wing bases to each other. And then it has a short face. It has a very short cheek, very, very short, actually. So that is a clear distinguishing character. Oh, and I wanted to say the other third purple arrow is pointing at T2. So that's the second tergum. And the very center, it is almost always going to be yellow in this animal. So you can see in the graphics, many of them have yellow on T2 right in the center. So this is not an easy bee to identify at first, but that is a commonality across most, but not all of the color patterns that we will encounter. This is crotch bumblebee or Bombus crotchy. This species is a special one. This is nearly endemic to California, meaning it occurs in a place and nowhere else on Earth. It is also found there's maybe 1 or 2 records from Nevada and a handful from Baja California del Norte, but it is not found in any other US states or in Canada. This is truly a California bumblebee. If we needed to pick a state bee, I would choose Bombus crotchy. It's emblematic of the state. It is a denizen of coastal sage scrub and many other types of habitats. And as you can see from the distribution in the map, it has declined and it has shifted its range to some extent over time. So most of the observations these days come from south of the transverse ranges from Los Angeles to San Diego and sparingly farther inland eastward. We still do see collections or observations from farther north. I saw them in Chico last year from a volunteer who's on a call today. I've seen some really wonderful observations from the San Francisco Bay Area last year. But for the most part, this is a bee you will find in Southern California. It is large, it has very short hair, it has a short malar, short cheek, so the malar space ratio is less than 1. And it may or may not have red hair at the tip of the abdomen. It's a beautiful animal, it's very distinctive. The males have very large eyes. This one is fairly easy to learn to identify, and you're lucky if you run into it. This is one of the 6 California species of greatest conservation need, and our acronym for that is SGCN. Okay, I think this is the last one with orange on it that I want to show you. This is called high country bumblebee. This is a very special animal to me because it's part of a group of bumblebees that there's only one representative that's found in the continental US, and that's this one. They are more Arctic or boreal species found at very high elevations. So you can see from the maps that it is found in Colorado and northern New Mexico, but sparingly at the highest elevations. There is a disjunct population in the Sierra Nevada. It is completely separate by hundreds of miles from the next closest population farther north and east. So our population in California of this species is stuck essentially. It doesn't have, I presume, it doesn't have gene flow to these other populations. And with climate change, we know that bumblebees are moving up in elevation. So this is a species that time is ticking for, and we don't think necessarily that it's in trouble in California yet, but look at how few observations we have in total. It definitely is extant or still lives in the state, but this project will help us to understand just how widespread it actually is in the state. It's a long-haired species with a very long cheek and usually black hair with a little bit of yellow hair on the face. Now I'd like to move into the bees that have stripes of various sorts on the abdomen, but have that first abdominal segment, the T1, as yellow rather than black. And you may notice that I'm now going backwards through these graphic slides that I showed you already. I did that just to reduce the time it would take to get through all of them. So this is 10 species here. We will not talk about all of them, but I'll show you a smattering of them here. So the first one is the black-tailed bumblebee, or Bombus melanopagus, or melanopagus, depending on what part of the Latin-speaking world you come from. This species in California is almost entirely of the black and yellow morph, not the red morphs. So if you're in Colorado, if you're in Washington or British Columbia, in all likelihood, if you see this bee, it will be one of the red morphs in the diagrams. However, in California, virtually everywhere, it's going to be the black and yellow types. For example, the picture on the right, I took last summer at California Botanic Garden in Pomona or Claremont. So that's typically how they look here in the state. The California populations used to be called Bombas edwardzi. We now know it's the same species, and we synonymize the two under the name melanopagus. You don't really need to know that, but that's a little context for you. This is a very common species. It comes out early. To me, it is a classic visitor of manzanita and arbutus, strawberry tree, those types of early spring flowering plants. If you want to see this bee, find a flowering manzanita and be patient, and you will find it, I think. Okay, now we're back to Bombus bifarious, another common one, and this has been my exemplar in some other slides for other things, so you're somewhat familiar with it. This is a species that is mostly found in the Sierra Nevada and the northern mountains, but again, there is a population around the San Francisco Bay Area. This is a common species throughout the West. However, I would say that that map indicates that it may have a smaller range in California now than it did in the past, although that could reflect a lack of collecting by people. So again, this is another justification for joining our project and going out to some of these locations and looking for this bee. Throughout most of its range, this bee will have red on it, as depicted in the center graphics. But in California, most populations are going to be of the black and yellow variety. And you'll notice this bee looks a lot like the last one. Let me just zip back. There's melanopagus, a series of black and yellow bands. Here's bifarious. There are some field characteristics that can help us to distinguish them. Namely, the hairs on the tarsus that carries the pollen tend to be orangey red instead of black. The face is a little bit different. So the cheek is just shorter than it is shorter than it is wide, whereas in the previous one, it's about equal. And then importantly, you see this notch, this black hair on the thorax that trends backward through the thorax yellow hair. That notch is distinctive. You can see it in most or all of these color pattern diagrams in the center. So this one will be hard at first, but you will get used to it after a while, and it can be quite common. The other thing I'll say about this one is, I guess I referenced it earlier, but recently it was split into 2 species, possibly 3. Other researchers think that it's just one large variable species. I think we need to wait and see what happens with that. But just so you know, many populations are now called Bombas vancouverensis, as in Vancouver. So you'll see that name, and we mean the same, this broader taxon part. Here's another one that in California is mainly black and yellow. However, you could see some red morphs in the Sierras. Outside of California, for example, where Rich works in Washington and Oregon, you would see almost entirely these red banded morphs. So keep that in mind. This is another widespread Western species, quite common in many places. I think we'll find that this one is quite common in California also at the end of the project, but we'll see. One thing that distinguishes this one from some similar bees is it has a distinctively long cheek. So its close relatives, many of them have a cheek that's about square or even shorter than it is shorter than it is wide. This one has a distinctively longer than wide cheek. And there are a couple other field characters I indicate there, including the presence of black hair mixed into the yellow hairband on the thorax, in the front of the thorax. This is Bombus griseocollis, the brown-belted bumblebee referenced earlier in the diagram distinguishing male and female bees. Same image of the queen here. This is actually a picture taken in Vermont, but the bee does occur clear across the continent, and in not so much in the Southwest, but we do get it in Northern California, about as far south as Arcata. You shouldn't find it anywhere farther south than that. If you do, that's wonderful. Please report it. But it's a bee that's kind of restricted to northern and coastal places for the most part in California. It has short hair. It has a characteristic rusty or brownish colored patch of hair on T2, especially centrally or medially. That rarely can be missing, as you see in those diagrams, but that is the thing to look for. Its hair is short, even, and kind of velvety in color. And it has a short malar space. It has a short cheek, so the malar space ratio is less than 1. This is a very common species where it occurs. It's an increasing species in the East. It is probably secure in California also, but we will find out. At least one more in this group, and this is an important one for us. This is Bombus pennsylvanicus, the American bumblebee. In California, populations are known as Bombus sonoris, as in Sonoran Desert. Many researchers believe these are the same species, and I will call it pennsylvanicus or American bumblebee for now. With time, I believe that we're going to see several other species split out of American bumblebee, at least in Mexico, but sonoris may or may not be its own species. We'll call it pennsylvanicus for now. This bee is widespread, as you can see from the thumbnail map. However, in California, it is in trouble. It is still quite common locally in Southern California, as you can see. However, it used to range widely through the northern San Joaquin Valley and the San Francisco Bay Area. It is almost entirely gone from that area. You are unlikely to see it there, and I sure hope you do, and I sure hope you report it if you do. But that's a very, very distinctive range shrink, and that actually is shrinking southward rather than northward, as we might expect with climate change effects. We don't understand what's going on here, but this is a bee that is not on our list of SGCN species of greatest conservation need. However, it may earn a place there with time if it continues to retreat. This is a beautiful bee with distinctive black or dark black colored wings. In California, it should have 3 yellow stripes on the abdomen. It has a long cheek and is pretty distinctive. It's relatively easy to distinguish this one from other species. Oh, I want to show you 2 more in this group quickly. This is Nevada bumblebee. This one is common, widespread in the West. In California, it is mainly found east of the Sierras and in the northeastern corner of the state. It prefers high plains, sagebrush flats, a variety of other habitats, but it's a classic bee of the steppes of Western North America. Has numerous 3 yellow stripes on the abdomen, relatively short hair. It has a long cheek, and this one is quite common throughout its range. There is a historic, 2 interesting things about California populations of this bee. There are collections from Humboldt County and from San Miguel Island in the Santa Catalinas that have this red tail, as you see in that graphic, making it look a lot like crotchy, the bee that we just met. Nobody has reported these since the 1930s. Maybe you'll be the person who sends in a photo of these rare morphs of Nevada bumblebee. I sure hope so. But this is a common species that we believe is probably doing well. This is a closely resembling species that is not doing well. This is Morrison bumblebee. It is on California's SGCN list. It's one of the 6 species we're really concerned about. It is yet another species that is mainly confined to the areas east of the Sierras, the east slopes and the valleys around Bishop and out towards the Mojave. This is a bee that is declining steeply despite a wide range in the West. It's not as rare as some of the species we're concerned about, but we're concerned about how quickly it is becoming uncommon. In this bee, to distinguish it from the previous one, Nevada bumblebee, it has a short face. The cheek is shorter than it is wide. And so if you get a good look at that part of the body for either of these 2 species, there's no question it is a distinctly different cheek. But we also see differences in the color of hair on the vertex. The color of hair overall in Morrison's bumblebee, this is a bee that has a brilliant orangey yellow color that I've tried to illustrate with this photo taken in full sunlight and true color. It's just distinctive, beautiful color. And in nevadensis or Nevada bumblebee, that last one, it's a little duller, a duller yellow. No shame for this bee, but it is just not quite as lovely as Morrison bumblebee. And this is not a great field character to tell you it's just extra yellow. But with time, I think that you'll agree that this yellow is this distinctive, velvety, buttery, just beautiful hue of yellow that can help you to identify this bee. Again, this is one of our rarities, and we lack a full understanding of its distribution in California. So we will find out. I think the last one in this group is forest bumblebee. I am showing a picture of an individual with red on its abdomen here. But in California, we have both red and black, and this is the category where I was showing only those black morphs. Sorry, but this is the photo that I was able to obtain. This is a high elevation species for the most part. It is found in the Sierras, and there are historic records from the Siskiyous and Klamaths. However, there are no modern records that I'm aware of from those same places, despite there being some bumblebee collections from the Siskiyous and the Klamaths. So it is important that we find out whether this bee is losing ground in California. perhaps due to a warming world and it's marching upward in elevation, or changes in the structure of the vegetation at high elevation that it depends on. The species has longer hair. Its face has a square cheek, not very useful for distinguishing it from some of the others, but there you have it. And depending on where you see it, it will have either those orange bars or black bars on the abdomen. Let's talk a bit about the striped abdomen bumblebees that have black hair only on T1. So the previous 5 or 6 species, those all had yellow on T1, right? So we have a whole other set where your first pass is you look at it and you see that it's kind of stripy on the abdomen, and it doesn't fit into the red color category. It doesn't fit into the white color category. And oh, the first T1 is black. This group includes some of our most common species. This is our most common species in California. Honestly, this one could easily be California's state insect also. This is Voznesensky bumblebee, also known as yellow-faced bumblebee. Some people will group it with 2 other species and call them the yellow-faced bumblebees. For an obvious reason, it has copious, beautiful, light yellow, sort of lemony yellow hair on the face and the vertex, and usually a strong yellow, all yellow band in the front of the thorax. And then it has 1 yellow stripe on the abdomen. In this species, it is always on T4. Okay, so 6 abdominal segments. In the female, it is T4 that is yellow there. And then the underside of the abdomen is all black hair. The sternal segments, 3, 4, 5, 6, they're black. This is to contrast it with another yellow-faced bumblebee that we'll look at in just a second. If you look at the range map, you see this species has been collected broadly along the coast, in the Sierras, in the northern mountains, even into the Mojave a little bit. This species occurs broadly in the state. However, it does not occur very far from the Pacific coast. There are scattered Nevada records. There are scattered Eastern Oregon records, but virtually the entire species is found from southern BC to northern Baja California, and only about like 150 miles east from the ocean. So very typical of California and very common at this time. Now, oh, sorry, I wanted to say that that species has shorter hair, and its cheek is about equal. The length is equal to the width. This is a very similar looking species. This is Bombus caliginosus, also known as obscure bumblebee, aptly named because it is difficult to distinguish it from Voznesensky's bumblebee. This one we think is quite rare. And if you look at that range map, you can see that it was formerly found up and down the coast. This is a classic Pacific coast distributed species. If you look at the global range map there, it is even more closely allied to the fog belt and to coastal type habitats, including coast ranges at some elevation, but not far from the Pacific. This species has longer hair than Voznesensky's bumblebee. It has a yellow stripe on T4, just like Voznesensky's. It has yellow hair on the face, the vertex, and the front of the thorax. Its hair overall is shaggier and longer, and then it should have, in most specimens, this yellow hair on the underside of the abdomen, on sternal segments, so S, 4, 5, and or 6. It doesn't have to be all of the hair. It's usually just a few wispy yellow hairs. And so for this reason, you don't have to know that you're holding Bombus caliginosus, but you do need to take a good photo of the underside of the abdomen, or from the side like this one, if you have a yellow-faced bumblebee in hand. Okay, so again, this is one of our SGCN species that we're concerned about, and we are excited to better understand following this work that you are joining us in. The third yellow-faced bumblebee is Van Dyke bumblebee, another one that occurs close to the Pacific coast. You can see from the global range, it's very similar to the first 2. It's southern BC, I think, yeah, just a very few collections in southern British Columbia, and it's found in Washington, Oregon, and California, only as far south as the transverse ranges. I should have said that for caliginosus, the last one. It stops right about at Santa Barbara. So if you're in San Diego and you find one of these bees, it's got to be Voznesensky's bumblebee, because neither of the other 2 occur that far south. So you can use range to help you understand what species you're looking at to some extent, right? So how do we distinguish this yellow-faced bee from the other two? Well, its hair is shaggy like calaginosis. I forgot to say with calaginosis that the cheek is just slightly longer than it is wide. It's very hard to be sure of this, but it, on average, will have a longer cheek than Vosnesenski's. This one has still longer. So this one will reliably have a longer than wide cheek, or a malar ratio of greater than 1. But it does have shaggy hair like calaginosis or obscure bumblebee. The way that it is obviously different and very easy to distinguish is the placement of the yellow band on the abdomen. That is T3, not T4. So if you go over to the center graphic here, the little thumbnail sketches, you can count those segments and you see that the yellow is on the 3rd of those 6 abdominal segments in the females. It varies in how extensive it is, but it is the 3rd segment, not the 4th. So Van Dyke's should not be that hard to distinguish from Vosnesensky and obscure bumblebees, but they look quite similar on the wing when they're zipping back and forth, and you need to get a good look before you can be sure. Another bee in this group, so again, the group being stripy abdomen with black on T1, the first of those abdominal segments. This is Bombus fervidus, or the yellow bumblebee. In California, the populations are extensively black, very similar in gross color pattern to the yellow-faced bumblebees that we just discussed. And this picture here is taken in California. This is a very typical look for this bee. This bee occurs across the continent, although the populations in and around California used to be known as Bombus californicus, so California bumblebee. We now think it's one large variable species with different populations. So we'll call it Bombus fervidus, but just understand that if you hear about a Bombus californicus, this is it. How can you distinguish this from the yellow-faced bumblebees? Well, it does not have a yellow face. That is the first thing to see. It should have all and entirely and only black hair on the face. And those other ones are just have copious amounts of yellow hair on the face. But otherwise, these bees will look very similar. This guy has a relatively short hair length, even short hair, a stripe of yellow usually placed on T4, like Vosnesensky's and obscure, and they co-occur in many of the same habitats. I do want you to notice that in the central graphic here, you see a lot of variation in the amount of yellow on the bee. It is the Eastern North American populations that have the yellowest look to them. So the bees on the left side of this graphic, those are typical for the Northeast. Southern Canada, adjacent US. We can see intermediate forms in places like Oregon and Washington and Idaho. And in California, they're almost all going to be these heavily black ones with yellow stripes. So that should humble you and give you an appreciation for the variation that we see in one species. And I'll just remind you that we've talked about these mimicry complexes. Look at how extensively the color pattern has shifted between Eastern and Western populations, and how closely the Western populations agree with those yellow-faced bumblebees that we just discussed that are found on the East Coast. So we think that this is convergent evolution on a color pattern that helps them stay alive in the face of predation. Although I don't think that we have all the evidence we need to make that claim. It's just hard to know. A couple more in this group. This is Franklin bumblebee, and we've mentioned it a couple times because this is the one that's on the endangered species list at the federal level as endangered. It is endemic to California and Oregon. It has the smallest home range of any bumblebee that we know of on Earth, with perhaps one exception. You can see from the North America map there, all the points are just clustered around the California-Oregon border. And that is everything we know about this bee. There is a sum total of about 300 observations. It is definitely a real species and has been understood as such for a long time. It has not been observed in the wild alive since 2006, despite efforts by Dr. Robin Thorpe and his colleagues, and then others who have come after him to find it. Some of us think it's extinct, some of us do not. And what we lack, what we need actually is more eyes on the ground. So that's why it's so important that volunteers such as yourselves get out into Trinity County and Siskiyou County and look for this animal once we're allowed to. So remember that this is the one where we have to close 9 of those good cells until sometime in May or early June, depending on when we get that recovery permit. Anyway, this bee is extensively black on the abdomen. There is almost always some degree of yellow at the tail end of the bee. There's a distinctive black notch in the thorax hair. So the thorax is mainly yellow with some black on the sides and at the back of the thorax. And you can see this U shape that we depict in the little graphic in the center. It's quite distinctive and should help you to distinguish this bee from one of its close relatives, which is the Western bumblebee. Some others that are less closely related also look quite similar. And by the way, this is a short-cheeked species. It's in a group of bumblebees with Western and with the rusty patch and the yellow-banded that have cheeks that are shorter than they are wide. Okay, so let's move on to bees that have some white hair present somewhere. I'm going to quickly check my timer. I'm going to wrap this up in the next 5 minutes. So we just have 3 species in this group. Bombus appositus, the white-shouldered bumblebee, is typical of higher elevations. It's found broadly throughout the West. It's a distinctive bee. I think it's quite easy to identify it to species. It is mostly yellow or orangey on the abdomen and on parts of the thorax. However, it has white hair instead of yellow hair on the front of the thorax. So you'll have a whitish yellow band and then a black band and then a yellow band. This is a bee that, based on this map alone, would seem to potentially be declining a little bit, but it's certainly not rare throughout the West, and we'll see what we learn about its status in the state of California. This is the Western bumblebee. It is currently being considered by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as part of a species status assessment to determine whether it should be listed as threatened or endangered. I will guess that it will end up on the list as either threatened or endangered based on its status. It was once one of the most common bees to be found throughout the West and is now uncommon or missing from many places. In California, it was very, very common along the North Coast in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 20th century. It is now gone from those places as far as we can tell. This should not dissuade you from looking for it. Please go looking on the coast for the species north of around Monterey Bay is where the southernmost populations are. It's a distinctive bee with a short cheek. It has some degree of white or yellowy white hair on the abdomen towards the tip of the tail. It has that distinctive yellow patch of hair on the front of the thorax. And this is one we're really concerned about. It's became rare in the 1990s and really has not recovered very much since that time. Another bee, to the untrained eye, this one might look similar to the Western bumblebee. It's a bit smaller, shaggier, longer, uneven hair, and it has a sort of pinkish yellow, almost whitish hair at the tip of the tail, and quite a lot of black hair mixed into the front yellow band on the thorax. And it will have a longer cheek than the Western bumblebee. This one, the cheek is about square. So even though it's not that long, it is longer than the Western bumblebee. This guy is largely confined to the Pacific coast, although we do have historic observations from the mountains. And I will just say, I take at face value that these are accurate, these observations from the Sierras. However, it is possible those are misidentifications and that the bee never occurred in the Sierras. We'll have to see what we find in the California Bumble Bee Atlas. But this one should be expected to be locally common along the north coast in the state of California, and it does range all the way out to the Aleutian Islands. Finally, let's quickly talk about cuckoo bumblebees. We have 3 species in California, Flavitis, insularis, and sucklei. Insularis is common where it does occur. Remember that these are the bees that are social parasites of other bumblebee species. So this one attacks many other hosts, many other species. It's found principally in the Sierras as well as the northern mountains. Although you can see from the map, there are observations elsewhere. It has a distinctive patch of yellow hair on the face between the antenna, right at the base of the antenna. It has that black band across the abdomen. It has yellow hair in particular parts of the abdomen. I'll leave it at that for now. This can be tricky to distinguish from some of the other cuckoo bumblebees, but I'm going to leave it at that for now. Oh, and also that the yellow hair on the side, the hair on the side of the thorax is normally yellow, not black, but that's usually not always. This is another not uncommon species called fernal cuckoo bumblebee, or Bombus flavitis, found broadly in the US and Canada, found mainly in the mountains here in California, found less commonly, but it does have a number of different hosts, and I think we can expect to find it in many places. It has black hair on the face as compared to Insularis, which we just saw with the yellow hair. The males have a distinctive patch of orange hair at the tip of the tail. The females have yellow, where I've indicated here. And then also, this will take time, but the last segments of the abdomen, the terga and the sterna, the two segments are about the same size. And as you'll see in the next species, the sternal segments are much larger and they stick out from underneath the tergal segments, so that if you look from above the bumblebee, you can actually see those underside plates sticking out the sides. This used to be called fernality. We don't have to deal with that particularly, but that is a little trivia for you. Finally, last one, this is Bombus sucklei, suckly bumblebee. This bee is distributed throughout the West. There is a disjunct population in eastern maritime Canada. In California, it has only ever been found in the mountains in extreme northern California. And we don't have any observations recently. This is one of our SGCN species. It is truly rare throughout the continental US. It is still being found in northern Canada and Alaska, but this is a rare bumblebee and it could still occur here. So we very much want your observations of this one. Here we are seeing black facial hair, yellow on the side of the thorax. As I said, this really big, obvious sternal character at the very end of the tail, but I don't have a good image of it to show you here. And I'll skip the other characteristics, but this bee is a real goal for us. If we can get more observations of this bee from Northern California, that will really be a success for the project. So just quickly, I've told you a little bit about these identification resources that we have. I'm going to glide right through that and just say thank you for your patience with us going a little bit over time, and especially with this last segment, which can be a little tedious because you've already been sitting still for hours. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your willingness to try this project. I think you'll be rewarded if you go further with it. The next step for you will be to take a quiz, which is, we think, pretty easy. It just demonstrates that you were here, basically, and you paid attention. Especially you paid attention to the parts that Dylan presented on the scientific collecting permit, the legal aspects of the project. So we can post a link to that in the chat. And with that, I'll stop talking. And if Rich, Dylan, do you think we should take a few questions?
Yeah, that's fine. Rich had to step out for a family matter, but okay. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, a lot of them have been answered in the Q&A section. But let's see.
Let me answer the one remaining question. What are the classes on 30 and 31st of March that we signed up for? So to be clear, we are doing this workshop that you participated in today 3 separate times at least. So you do not have to go to that on March 30th and 31st. That is the same material that we've presented today. So please don't bother coming to that one unless you want to. You only have to do this once. So this is your training today. Someone else is asking, can we take the quiz without a Google account? And yes, certainly you can. This is a Google Doc form that we're linking to here. Let me just, while I'm talking, let me just grab the address and put it in the chat. So anybody can access this. It's just a website. It's an easy way for us to give you 10 questions and for you to answer them, and then for your responses to get recorded in a digital fashion, so we know how you did. So here it is in the chat. So go ahead and you can click that link. You can take this quiz more than once. If you don't get a high enough score to quote unquote pass, go ahead and do it again. Maybe go back to what you can do is we record these workshops, and there is currently one that has been recorded, and it's on YouTube on the Xerces Society channel. It's called California Bumble Bee Atlas. We recorded it back in November, so you could go and watch the relevant parts again if you need to. I have no doubt that everybody can pass this quiz. It's not just a formality, but we've made it so that it's fair and easy. So please don't feel any sort of anxiety about the fact that there is a test involved here.
Yeah, go ahead, if I think you saw the same question.
Important question. If I want to bring family, do they all have to take the quiz to help? So yeah, we've had this question numerous times, and I should have addressed it already today. You can bring friends and family with you. This is more fun in groups for most of us, but only people who have taken the training like you did today and passed the test and gotten their name recorded on the scientific collecting permit are allowed to collect the bee in the net, put the bee in the vial, handle the bee while she's anesthetized. The others who may join you can do all of the other stuff. They can be the data recorders, they can handle the bee in the vial as it goes into the cooler and hand it to you and all that good stuff. They can record all of the data. My children have participated in these projects in that way before. Anybody could join you. However, only the people who are on the scientific collecting permit can swing the net and actually handle the bee. So think about that as you plan to do this work with others. If you have friends and family who want to do all of the things, encourage them to go watch the training on YouTube or join us on March 30th and 31st and get certified to be on the permit.
Great. Leaf, Lisa asked if you have any idea when the preliminary results will be shared.
Yeah, so preliminary results for this project. So all of you will be uploading your data to Bumblebee Watch, and then Rich, myself, and some others, we will go through and we'll verify the identifications of all of the bees. We typically don't get to that in any volume until fall of the year that the bee data was collected. And so please be patient with us. If you submit data in June, I may not even see it until September or October. However, I can promise you that we will complete all of that each fall. We have to for reasons of meeting funding obligations and such. So we will get to your bees. It just may take us until September, October, even early November. If you're itching to know, you are always free to contact me by email, and I'll do my best to help you out. Especially if you find something unusual in the field and you just have to know now, please reach out, because I want to know also.
Definitely.